Jeffrey, thank you very much. Thank you all for that nice, warm reception. Jeffrey asked me earlier, for any counsel, I said, let's keep that introduction short and have fun. And I am always pleased when at least 50% of my counsel is followed. Jeffrey, that was outstanding, and I thank you very much. And I appreciate you all taking time to share part of your evening with me. It's a privilege that I truly respect and honor and deeply appreciate. I wrote the book Independence Day because I think that there is a deep and absolutely unequivocal need in this country for us to recognize the reality in which we all find ourselves. A reality that is not partisan, but nonpartisan, that is not ideologically framed, but rather as independent as it possibly can be. And I believe absolutely, unequivocally, without any posturing whatsoever, that we as a people must awaken to that reality now. As we watch, well, let me ask you this. How many of you watch my broadcast? So, we may just linger here a couple of hours if you don't mind. Let me ask another question. This may sound faintly like the House Un-American Activities Committee from the 50s, but how many of you are now or have ever been affiliated with either the Republican or the Democratic parties? We have all sinned. We have an opportunity to redeem ourselves, and we can start, I think, right now. I am a person who, first of all, believes that it is time, perhaps past time in reality, to focus on a new effort to be rationalists in this country rather than ideologues. I think it is time for us to focus on empiricism rather than republicanism or democratism. I think it is time for us to focus on our state of being as Americans rather than on our dissimilarities, our differences, and our distinctions from one another. We are a society that has been overwhelmed by group and identity politics. We have permitted ourselves to be sliced and diced demographically, culturally, ethnically, socially, racially, religiously, by income, by geographical region, and triangulated by the savants, gurus, strategists, and analysts of our political system. You and I are unrecognizable to one another at the hands of those strategists. We are different from one another because we are of different ages, different races, our skin is of a different color, we make different amounts of money, we work. 17 candidates of both political parties today want you and me to forget that we are first and foremost, unequivocally, without posturing or apology, first and foremost Americans. I truly believe that both political parties have abandoned the basic national values of this country as the standards against which we should repair whenever we conduct and formulate and carry out public policy. Those two national values are straightforward. They're embodied in our founding documents, articulated by every founder of this country. They are two values that when we respect them as values, accept them as a credo of our everyday lives, can determine our ultimate destiny as a nation and assure a future for our children and their children. And they are two values that when we ignore them, we do so at the peril of the nation, at the peril of our people. And we certainly prescribe the possibilities of future generations. Those two values are first and foremost individual liberty and equality of rights, equality of opportunity, opportunity of education, economic opportunity. Two values that define the nation, define our history, and which, when we are as zealous and jealous of those rights for one another, make the promise of 200 years possible for everyone to follow us. As I watch those 17 candidates for the Republican and Democratic parties, how many of you have, by the way, I'd like to answer this question wherever I am. I've been traveling across the country here over the last month or so. How many of you have a candidate that you just feel absolutely certain, righteously in your stomach, your gut, and your heart, and your mind, is ready to lead this nation into the 21st century with clarity of vision, with certainty of principle? How many of you? Look around, folks. Keep your hands in the air. I want you to look around. What in hell do you know that the rest of us are missing? Folks, it's time for us to confront some realities. Here's the reality. I was one of those folks who, in the 6th grade, I was a poor kid. I never lived in a house that my parents didn't rent. I went to school with blue jeans and a t-shirt and thought I was dressed to the nines. Because luckily I went to school with a lot of other kids who were just as poor. Now, we had some fancy folks in their chinos and plaid shirts. But I better just speak for myself. I was so dumb I didn't know you called them chinos. But the reality is I grew up in a system, a public school system, that really treasured the original purpose of public education. My teachers, my principals, they truly believed that public education was the great equalizer in our society. They truly believed it didn't mean anything. How you dressed, where you came from, where you jumped off the bus, where you got on the bus. It's what you did in that school. And I can name 6 teachers who made all the difference in my life. How many of you can think back to those public school teachers? Now, some of you are going to be products of privilege, and that's great. That's part of the American dream as well. But how many of you can remember a half dozen public school teachers who made a difference in your life? Now look around. Look around at those hands. That's certainty. That is sharing a real truth. We have to confront the reality that our public education system is failing an entire generation of Americans. Nearly half of all the black students in this country are dropping out of high school. Nearly half of all Hispanic students, nearly half of all, just about a third of all white students. We have dropout factories instead of high schools. We have a debate between the NEA and the FTA, the 2 principal teachers unions in the country, and conservatives about vouchers, and we have liberals who want to talk about magnet schools and charter schools and talk about choice. The conservatives love choice. Well, let me suggest to you that there is a common American choice, one that we can all get around, put our arms around, and actually make a reality. Here is the choice in public education. Make every single one of our public schools an institution that you and I are proud of, that provides excellent, excellent public education to every student, period. And make that a reality immediately. And before you ask, I want to pay teachers. I want to pay them what they deserve. And by God, they deserve an immense amount. But show me a teacher who puts tenure above performance, and I'll show you a teacher I want out of public education. You know, I can't believe in this day and age that we're even having a discussion, frankly, about some of these issues. Free trade. You want to pursue free trade? 31 consecutive years of trade deficits. a $6 trillion trade debt that's rising faster than our $9 trillion national debt, and idiots in Washington, D.C. want to tell you that faith-based economics works? Give me a break. Keep faith in the public square by all means. Practice your religion with the greatest of respect from all of us. But don't ask me to buy into faith-based economics or governance on the part of this institution we call the federal government. We have a government that is utterly dysfunctional. What's the debate? The federal government provides 8% of the funding for public education and can't even get that right. The federal government is made up of an executive, a legislative, and judicial. I can speak to you unequivocally about the White House. This president has been an utter and complete disaster. I can speak to you as well of the Democratic leadership of the Senate and the House. They have been a disaster. These two political parties are owned lock, stock, and barrel by corporate America and special interests. I'm going to beg you to consider, if you are not already an independent, to consider registering as an independent. To push back against both of these parties who are taking all of us for granted when they are nothing more than branding mechanisms and fundraising organizations. They're not only taking us for granted, they're taking us for abject fools. And by the way, to this point, I think they've been right. Because we have permitted this partisanship and ideology to override our common good, our common purpose, our national interest. If ever there were a time for independent thinking and critical judgment, living free like a real American, being as invested in one another's rights and opportunities as we are in our own, it is now. If there is a single issue that overrides all public policy questions today, in my judgment, it is the failure of our government to represent the will of the majority. You are considered a complete and utter contemptible unit of labor, consumer, and taxpayer by political, governmental, and business elites. This country we call the United States of America is considered to be first and foremost an economy and a marketplace by the elite establishment. And until you and I demand that we be regarded by every institution and every elite in this country as first and foremost as citizens, and that the United States be regarded by those to whom we give our consent to be governed, that this be considered first and foremost a sovereign nation, we will be unable to solve the immense challenges that confront this nation. Whether it is a war on terror that is properly, by the way, I am one of those who, frankly, I get gut sick at the idea that this administration will not even name the enemy in this war on terror. We are in a war against radical Islamists, and we must articulate the name of the enemy if we're to prevail. When we look at the war in Iraq and Afghanistan, we've got to understand that we are, to this point, losing thousands of lives. We are permitting our military to go to war while we as a nation remain apathetic and all but indifferent to the sacrifice and the burdens carried by our young men and women in uniform. And that is un-American. We have to have political parties that say to you, and I know this is going to take you out of your comfort zone, many of you, and it's going to take you out of your hidebound orthodoxy to which you probably cling in some parts of this room. But ladies and gentlemen, we can never ask any American to risk his or her life in uniform unless we as a nation are committed to that conflict, to that war, and share the burden and the sacrifice across our society. We can learn much from one another by first recognizing that we're in this together, and that no matter the divisive attempts by partisan politicians and the ideologues on the left and the right, the liberals and the conservatives, this nation has always persevered and prospered when we govern from the center, which is where nearly every American lives. You are now watching a primary system in which the left will dominate the Democratic primaries and the right will dominate the Republican primaries. Two candidates will be produced from this great 300 million strong society of ours, so rich, so diverse, that we may in fact be treated once again in 2008 to what we experienced in 2004. Two candidates emerging so different, so clear-cut in their unique personal experiences and histories that you knew that our nation's future was assured. 2004, when we produced two candidates, Democrat and Republican, both sons of privilege, both graduates of Yale, both members of Skull and Bones. I know that you, like I, we're just so sincerely proud that we can produce that kind of stark contrast, philosophically, ideologically, and in partisan and social terms. My God. If you don't get the joke now, I don't know what to tell you. But you got to feel good about one thing. This race is producing some interesting aspects. Let's see, if we go back to 1980, let's assume Senator Hillary Clinton, can I say this in this town? From 1980 to possibly 2016, with a little luck in the second term, it'd be 36 years in which we've had a Bush or a Clinton running the country as either president or vice president. Bush and Clinton, two names wedded forever in history. You would have guessed that, wouldn't you, about 1989, that it would happen that way. Is this the country that we really, really want? Is there anyone in this room who doubts? Are you so elitist, anyone in your secret heart, that you think that the great unwashed majority of Americans should continue to be ignored by our elites in Washington, D.C.? Is there anyone in this room who doubts that the basic and fundamental tenet of democracy is the rule of the majority? Because that fundamental tenet is being destroyed by the elites of both parties that we have elected, by corporate America that dominates the political process, our political process, both electorally and legislatively. The great crisis today in America, and there are many challenges and many issues that confront us, obviously, but the fundamental challenge is to achieve, once again, representation in this great free enterprise democracy for the people. That is the number one issue. It is the issue that I hope you will confront by considering registering as an independent and sending back a loud and clear message to Washington, D.C. It's time for us to reclaim our heritage and our destiny. Thank you very much.
we are going to take some questions. Let me have a little ground rules here. Please raise your hand. I will recognize you. For the sake of a lot of questions, please keep your questions short and no statements. This is a question and answer session, not a unload on Lou Dobbs session, okay?
What
so
session?
Please raise your hands and I will call on you.
And I promise to keep my answer
Let me see,
short.
right here. Okay, right here. Second row. And wait for the microphone, please.
I would like to present you with something prior to asking my question. Would that be?
No, ma'am. Ask your question, please.
Okay, my question is, when will you announce as our independent candidate for the presidency?
I can't imagine running for office, and as I've said for some time, I'm very flattered by the thought. You may look upon me as a candidate of last resort. I just can't imagine doing it. I love what I'm doing. I think what I'm doing, I frankly feel I'm gratified by the contribution that I'm making right now, and I am flattered by the thought. But thank you.
All right. Questions? Raise your hands, please. All right. Let's see. Let me go back here. Right, yes, sir. Right there. Please wait for the microphone.
This question is about Karl Rove and Dick Cheney. Do you remember when they first said that the Iraqi oil was going to pay for this war, and we haven't heard anything about it since? That was about 5 or 6 years ago.
Yes, and the man who ultimately became the head of the World Bank is actually the fellow who said that war would be paid for by oil. We've got to understand that this kind of thing cannot occur again in an administration of an American government. We've got to have people who are committed to national service, to public service. We've got to restore honor to this government. And it's going to require great changes in our society. But we've got to return to a point at which the elites had a sense of obligation. Corporate America considered each corporation a citizen of this country with responsibilities and sought empowerment of employees and not the destruction of their jobs or the breaking of that contract between employer and employee. The world has not changed that much. The values of many of our leaders have, and we've got to address the issue.
Questions? Mr. Mitchell, right here.
Mr. Dobbs, my name is James Mitchell. I'm a student here at the Clinton School. I'd say thank you for coming and speaking with us. You articulated your disdain for our free trade policies, and I was wondering if you could kind of briefly articulate the economic direction that you would like to see the country go in.
Yeah, when I make fun of the Bush administration, the Clinton administration, and frankly, since Fast Track Authority was put into effect in 1976, free trade policies, let me be clear. I'm talking about now the cumulative weight of empirical experience. We know that what we're doing isn't working. We have 31 years to convince ourselves of that if we will look at the facts. What is the relationship I would like to see in trade between the United States and its partners? Straightforwardly, the same guiding principles as followed by our trading partners, our principal trading partners. That is reciprocity, mutuality, and balance. And that is absolutely essential. It's common sense. Perhaps that's an alien concept, if you will, in Washington, D.C., but it is time for it to be embraced, because anything other than straightforward adherence to principle and policies is a disservice to the American people and to this nation. What direction of this economy would I like to see us move? I would like to see us move, instead of investing tens of billions of dollars in China, I would rather see tens of billions of dollars that have been invested in Mexico and in this hemisphere and in this country. I would like to see $1.5 trillion in public investment in our infrastructure. I would like to see significant investment by this government, by corporate America, by the private and public sector in our young people, in education, and in dealing with the issues of national health care, dealing with the issues that are crying out for resolution. Washington has become a place where problems go not to be solved, but to be perpetuated, and we have to change that.
Question. Back at the back, let's see, back at the back. Yes, sir. Wait, please wait for the mic.
Mr. Dobbs, would you please discuss, I believe, the Second Amendment concerning the right to bear arms that now confronts the Supreme Court?
You have discussed the Second Amendment, the right to bear arms that's now before the case before the Supreme Court.
Well, first of all, I'm delighted that the Supreme Court has taken up the issue. I am one of those folks, when I talk to you about individual rights, I mean precisely what I say. Forgive me for that. I try to say what I mean and mean what I say. I think the Washington, D.C. law constraining the use and the possession of a firearm for personal defense, and part of the armored guard who brought the case for the plaintiff in the case taken up by the Supreme Court last week, was absolutely wronged. I think that there should be absolutely a commitment in this country to individual rights without reservation. I believe that the Bill of Rights is rather straightforward. I believe further that we have a document of exceeding power and clarity, and that where great debates arise around our constitutional rights, it's usually because of obfuscation rather than heartfelt search for clarification. I believe that the Second Amendment guarantees the right to bear arms unequivocally. I believe the same Constitution means, without question, when we look to the 14th Amendment, equal and due process means precisely what it says. I support the right to bear arms and oppose gun control for the very same reasons I support gay marriage. I believe, well, first of all, in gay marriage, is there anybody in this room who would explain the physics to me of how gay marriage threatens heterosexual marriage? Anybody want to try that out for me? I'm sorry, folks. We've got families, nearly 1 in 2 marriages in this country end in divorce, most often because of money problems. And we're worried about gay marriage in this country, and some fool wants to start amending the great Constitution of this country. What in the world are we thinking about, and what are we allowing our political leaders to think about? That they could trivialize us and marginalize us to the point that you and I would focus more on gay marriage, gun control, and abortion than we would about the failure of our public schools, the failure of our elected leaders to represent the will of the majority.
Yes, right here, Harvey Joe.
Thank you. Mr. Dobbs, I don't know if you've been following football or not, but if you do decide to run for president and you would pick Houston Nutt as your running mate, you can carry Arkansas, I guarantee you.
You know, I was going to hook up with Houston down
Harvey
in Mississippi.
I know I got to be brief. but
Ask your question, Harvey Joe.
My question is this. Would you comment on the news of recent days about our friends Halliburton moving their corporate offices to Dubai to avoid paying taxes in the United States? Isn't that at the core of what's rotten with our system right now?
Yeah, you know, I'm going to do one of the, you know, I'm a man who prizes jobs in this country. I think it's critically important. But I would create a federal program to pick up the slack for every employee of Halliburton. Because I really think the solution right now for Halliburton is move the whole damn thing to Dubai and make certain they never have another federal contract because they overcharged the United States government during a time of war. I think it's time to hold corporate America accountable. Corporate America, and listen, there are a lot of great CEOs in this country, good men and good women. But there are also a good number of CEOs in this country who've forgotten what it means to be an American, who don't frankly give a damn about outsourcing a middle-class job to a cheap foreign labor market, creating a product or service and then sending back into this market, the greatest consumer market in the world, $12 trillion worth. I think it's time that we had a little discussion with those folks who have abdicated their leadership. Think about it. When's the last time you heard a corporate CEO in this country talk? Well, let's talk about Tyson Food, for example. Talk about the responsibility of corporate citizenship. talk about the responsibilities to the stakeholders of the state of Arkansas, for example. I'm not just picking on Tyson. I can go through 1,000 American companies without any trouble at all. But it's time for us to understand that if you're going to do business in America, you're going to invest in America. If you're going to exploit this market, as they love to put it, this nation is going to deliver a little bill at the end of the day. That first, you're going to take seriously your responsibilities to the communities in which you operate. You're going to take seriously your responsibilities to the consumers of your products and your services. And you're not going to get around U.S. trade policy by offshoring and outsourcing production for re-export into this economy. You're going to invest in our educational system. You're going to invest in our young people. You're going to invest in this nation. That's what I do.
All right, Ms. Abrams.
I watched you like I did Jack Parr every night.
Thank you.
You believe, as I believe, I'm an American in a country that has free speech. How does the world perceive people like you who exercise free speech? What is the impact of the external media on your speeches around my country?
Well, outside this country, I frankly don't give a damn. I've got, and by that I don't mean I'm indifferent to the welfare or the well-being or the souls of 5.5 billion people outside this nation. But it does mean that it's okay to talk about Americans and the welfare of American citizens and our national interest. I don't have to pretend to be a citizen of the world. I'm a citizen of the United States with every benefit and every advantage it brings. That brings with it responsibilities, but it certainly does not bring with it a responsibility for me to in any way subordinate my responsibilities as a citizen of this nation to anyone outside this nation. What do people in Mexico think of me, for example? They think that I am interfering with their heroes because the government of Mexico has convinced its poorest people that they will be heroes if they come to the United States and send back $25 billion a year in remittances to their families. And by God, I think they are heroes for doing so. They think that I am somehow reactionary because I want to control the borders of this country and our ports rather than permit a sense of entitlement that exists throughout Mexico that their poor citizens should be able to enter this country at will and work unencumbered by responsibilities of citizenship and legality for corporations and employers who hire them illegally and exploit them and then tell us what a wonderful benefit to our economy.
All right.
What do they think? What do they think of what I say, for example, in China? When I talk about the Red Storm rising and the U.S. Economic Review Commission, the U.S. China Economic Review Commission releases a report on the greatest military buildup in the last, better than the last decade in China. Or when I say to the Chinese, you have a little bit of a responsibility here to make sure you don't poison all of our children with toys, and we'd really appreciate it if you wouldn't put date rape drugs into your other toys. But as much as I'm concerned about that, again, I don't really care what the Chinese think. I do care about what Americans think, about a government that would permit all of these imports that we bring in from foreign producers to not be inspected by the Consumer Product Safety Commission, the Department of Agriculture, or government agencies, and to have no standard against which to demand safety for American consumers. This administration is committed 100% to commerce and the consumer be damned. And we've got to come to terms with reality. Like I say, I love the world. I got a job to do here because this is where I live.
Yes, ma'am, right
And
here.
happily so, I might add.
Yes, hello, Mr. Dobbs.
All right.
What I would like to ask you is, there's much talk coming from the White House about Iran and us going into Iran possibly. What are your thoughts about that? And do you feel that there are legitimate reasons being born for us to invade Iran? What are your thoughts about that?
Let me answer it in sort of a reverse order, if I may. If this administration and our military is correct that Iran is supporting through supplies and its own agents the killing of American troops in Iraq, I would insist upon immediate and determinate response militarily. And if I felt, as some do, that we could not protect our soldiers, our troops in the field, then I would withdraw all of our troops from Iraq, because it is unconscionable for us to put our troops in harm's way without being able to put the full force of the United States military behind their protection. So that's the first part. The second part is, in terms of war on the part of Iran, let's come to terms with something. This is a superpower, right? We're the world's only superpower. Folks, we have now been engaged in a war in Iraq for a greater duration than that of World War II. We're only now beginning to see some progress in that war over the course of the past 90 days. That's heartwarming. It's helpful. Let's hope it continues. But the idea that we have been stymied by a nation of 25 million people, a third world nation, an insurgency that is spending 1% of what we are to carry out this conflict, is absurd. And we need to understand where we have made huge mistakes, part of our civilian leadership, our general staff at the Pentagon, and the leadership in Iraq. This is not a sustainable conflict. We cannot spend, as we are estimated, the range rises to $2.4 trillion over a 10-year period for the cost of the war in Iraq. We cannot sustain that. And not being able to sustain that expense and further create debt for this nation of that magnitude is unrealistic. So we need new thinking, and we need honest discussion among these 17 candidates about what in the world are they talking about when they talk about withdrawing from Iraq at the end of 2008 without even a discussion of the consequences of the public policy in front of the American people. When one candidate says, well, we'll sign on to support the war, but we won't have the war. It's reminiscent of Kerry. I was against the war before I was for the war. By the way, in a tortured way, it sort of made sense. Then I got over that. But the reality is, we're not having a public debate in this country. These candidates are not discussing the issues in substance, and we're not demanding it in the mainstream media. And there's a special...
Okay. Mr. J.D. Lowry, right here.
Skip's bailing me out of my promise to be short in my answers. Thanks, Skip.
You're doing good.
My name is J.D. Larry. I'm a student at the Clinton School. Thanks for coming here tonight. Since you've lost faith in both the Democratic and Republican parties, could you name a few independent candidates that you feel are capable of leading our country and that the voters should look into?
The answer is I can't name that candidate. I can't name that person. But I do have, and I will admit this forecast is based on hope, equal parts hope and some considerable confidence that we're going to see an independent populist emerge over the next 90 days. Because as we all look around this room, folks, we're just reflective of every room in the country. There isn't a great passion for the two front runners in each party, let alone the rest of the candidates. We've got to have somebody we believe in. We need desperately a leader who believes in us. We haven't had that for years. We've got to have real leadership. We've got to return to participatory democracy. That means you and I have got to go to those school board meetings we all love so much. We've got to go to those city hall meetings. We've got to take back our communities, our neighborhoods. We've got to take back those schools.
Okay.
And then we won't have, and once we have representation in Washington, perhaps the questions about Iran will be answered by the Iranians.
Okay.
Imagine the response. Sorry, Skip.
All right, Mr. Dobbs.
No, I understand why you thought because that was pretty short, you thought you were going to go with it. But imagine the response if the Iranians, all those Ahmadinejad looked out there, and he saw in America that a people who looked upon themselves first as Americans, who were united behind their government, who had conviction that their government was telling them the truth, a government in whom they had trust at the local, state, and federal level, leaders who spoke directly and with conviction and principle. You know, I think a guy like Ahmadinejad would be scared to death. And I think that the consequence of that kind of unity in this country would be breathtaking for all the world to behold. And I think if you want to worry about being a citizen of the world, that would be the best way in the world to be a citizen of the world.
Ben, you got somebody back there?
Mr. Dobbs, related to the previous question, as a passionate American and a Gold Card member of the media, how would you change our presidential primary process that seems to be going on and on and on?
It's funny, you and I have had the same sort of conclusion about this, haven't we? It's one of those things that, you know, it seems like this process lasts forever, this presidential campaign. And then all of a sudden it's over. And you're left with two candidates and you wonder, how in the world did we get there? We have every possibility of this thing being over by February 5th. Now, you want to work that out? That's a long time to Election Day. But I'm sure that we're going to have straightforward examination of the issues by these candidates. The first thing I would do is I would return, and when I talk about participatory democracy at the local level, frankly, I would wrest from these parties their nonsense. There hasn't been a convention since 1968 that wasn't a contrivance and a fraud. The decisions had been made. You want to go somewhere and get a silly hat on your head and sort of stomp around? All right, have fun. But it has nothing to do with the political process because, as a friend of mine in college used to say, all the major decisions have been made. We've got to focus on these primaries coming much later. We have got to focus, and by the way, frankly, as far as I'm concerned, I don't care what they do with the primaries. I want everybody to register as independent and tell both parties to go to hell. But if they're smart, both of these political parties will re-engage at the grassroots level. And you will re-engage and demand more of these parties. I'm not saying any of this is going to be easy, but I am saying that the only certain way I know is to, once again, restore primacy to local politics and to wrest control from these parties until they mature into something that they should be, that is representative of great discussion about public policy from the standpoint of their history, their legacy, their traditions. These parties are unrecognizable to anyone who could have defined a party in 1950 or for that matter, 1960.
This is our final question. We're going to give it to a Clinton School student, Mr. Jatina. Eric, could you give him a microphone, please?
Did you say last one?
Final question, and then we're going to go two more. I thought we got 1,000 people on sign book.
So if you run or when you run, you're going to have to answer this question. All things considered, could you elaborate on the specifics on what you think would be the most sensible, fair, and feasible immigration plan for the U.S.?
Sure. Let's start with a couple of facts. One, don't we all find it interesting that no one knows the facts of illegal immigration? The estimates range from 12 to 20 million people in this country living illegally, illegal aliens. The facts. Both of the so-called comprehensive immigration reform legislation proposals by the Republican White House and the Democratic leadership in the Senate would have dealt with only 25% of the illegal immigration across our borders. Fact. The Heritage Foundation estimated the cost just in retirement benefits for those who would have been permitted into the United States under the terms of that legislation at as high as $2 trillion over the course of 30 years. Fact. Senator Ted Kennedy, Senator John McCain both understood the flaws of that system. Fact. 71% of the visas that would have been granted under the terms of comprehensive immigration reform would have gone to family members of those given a path to citizenship. 71%. Fact. 1965, Senator Ted Kennedy, one of the principal drivers behind immigration reform, to move away from national quotas, country quotas, for fear of a racial imbalance and preference. What in the world do you think we're doing in this country when more than 60% of the illegal aliens entering the country are from Mexico? I wonder why it isn't 60% from Africa. Why isn't it 60% from, say, Colombia? Why not 60% from Indonesia? Why isn't that a discussion in public policy? Why isn't anybody asking why, if we have a shortage of labor in this country, the 4 industries that employ the highest percentage of illegal aliens, they are construction, landscaping, leisure, and hospitality, that is, hotels and restaurants. Why is it then, in those 4 industries, wages have declined over the past 5 years? Why is it that so-called public servants would stand up on the floor of the United States Senate and say the time is now, with great righteousness in their voices, in great indifference to the welfare of the American people? What would I do? I would do precisely what I said several years ago. No one wants more than me a rational, effective, and humane immigration policy. But only a fool would even begin a discussion of immigration reform in this country until our borders and our ports were secure. I hope, no matter where you stand on this position, on this issue, that you will consider this syllogism, because I have laid it out to every lawmaker on either side of this issue over the course of the last 3 years. If you can tell me, if you can defeat this syllogism, I'll sign on to however you want to, whatever path you want to follow. The syllogism goes thusly. We cannot reform substantively immigration law and policy in this country if we do not control immigration itself. Correct? And we cannot control immigration unless we have control of our borders and our ports. And any other argument is pure specious nonsense. And by the way, this is America, and you can say things like that. The lady asked me about the reaction outside this country. Let me tell you what to free speech and my use of it. And I want to close with this. One of the most disheartening reactions has not been being called a racist or a xenophobe or an economic isolationist on the issues of illegal immigration or free trade, because that's all nonsense. But what hurts me most and concerns me most and should concern you, and I hope give you thought, a reason for thought and reflection, are those wonderful people who write to me and say, Lou, thank you for having the courage to speak out on these issues. for being so brave to talk about these issues. Ask yourself, what in the world has this nation become when any one of us could be credited with bravery or courage for simply speaking our minds? That isn't the nation I was born into. It isn't the nation that I want future generations to be born into. I want us to return to the standard that courage and bravery is about the way we live, the way in which we conduct ourselves, the way in which we treat one another, and the way in which we meet our obligations as citizens of this great nation, as independent Americans. Thank you very much.